Welcome y'all to the next relevant conversation, Inside Out, Mental Illness and Groundbreaking Solutions. We're going to talk about three mental illnesses in particular: depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. We're going to be covering the symptoms, how they are diagnosed, what they feel like to have them, some of the common misconceptions behind them, and what you can do for treatment, both for yourself and if you know somebody who has one of these. Oh, why is it not going to the next slide? There we go. So mental illness is not fun. In recent years, sometimes Hollywood has romanticized it, but it is anything but romantic. Mental illness can make life really tough to live. Depression can make us feel worthless no matter what we've accomplished in life, hopeless no matter the silver lining on the horizon, and unloved and unlovable despite being surrounded by loving people who truly do care about us. Anxiety can make enemies out of thin air and turn trivial tasks into these terrifying Olympian feats that we have to overcome. Everyone around us, friends and strangers, family members, can become critics echoing our own worst inner fears. And post-traumatic stress disorder can transport our minds to a battleground despite living in relative safety and luxury. First, let's cover depression, which is the most widespread of all of these mental illnesses. More than 300 people suffer worldwide from depression, according to the World Health Organization. And more than 17 million people in the US have severe depression. Mind you, there is a difference between severe depression and mild depression. Some depression is so debilitating that people struggle with what you and I might consider the simplest of tasks, like taking a shower or brushing their teeth, hygienic things, taking care of yourself. And other people's depression is a bit more mild. So it's got this undercurrent of melancholy and malaise that's constantly with them, but they are still able to function and get basic tasks done. Depression exists on a bit of a spectrum from very mild to very, very severe. But what does it feel like to have depression? Well, it feels like overwhelming sadness, worthlessness, hopelessness, like the burden of existence is too much and it would be better to give up. Activities that used to interest you or give you joy no longer do. And it's not a matter of the activities being less fulfilling in themselves. It's almost like you look at a beautiful picture that's always been beautiful, and now suddenly it's been sapped of all the color. And it's supposed to be more beautiful and fulfilling than it actually is, but suddenly it's not. It's like eating your favorite meal and finding it has no flavor, or listening to your favorite song and finding it has no rhythm. It's very common among depressed people. And sometimes you don't even realize that this is one of the symptoms until you articulate it out loud. So for me, for example, somebody asked me why I hadn't been writing, which I love, for a long time. And I said, well, it doesn't really seem worthwhile anymore. I mean, what's the point? And then hearing myself say that out loud, I was like, oh, hey, that might be something I should pay attention to. People with depression also can have trouble sleeping, or they might sleep too much. Because when life feels like a burden, it can be almost more palatable to be unconscious, to continue to sleep. They may have changes in appetite, weight gain or weight loss unrelated to dieting, a loss of energy or increased fatigue. There may be an increase in purposeless physical activity, such as wringing their hands or pacing, or slowed movements and speech. They may feel guilty with no apparent cause or an unjustified cause. This is really important, and this is honestly, to me, one of the strangest parts of having depression is it's like your brain will pick out things that are wrong with the world and then blame you for them. Or if it can't blame you for them directly, it will say, well, why aren't you doing anything about that? And since you're not doing anything about that, you shouldn't think so highly of yourself, and things like that. Difficulty thinking, concentrating, or making decisions is another symptom. And finally, the most severe one, thoughts of death or suicide. I want to be clear though, not everyone who has depression has thoughts of death or suicide, although that is one of the bigger warning signs for people who do. Depressed people often tend to be self-deprecating and self-loathing, and they may not think they deserve to feel better. From a depressed person's perspective, if you don't see your own self-worth, why would you want to help yourself? And if you don't think the future can get better because you don't have any hope for the future, what's the point even trying to make things better? They're never going to be better, so to speak, so your mind says. So why bother? Why try? Why get up in the morning? And that's why a lot of the times you'll see in depressed people, they'll wake up and they'll just stay in bed. Facing life, living is just a burden in and of itself. So where other people spring out of bed and they can't wait to go to do whatever it is they want to do with their day, depressed people will stay there like, what's the point? Now, how is depression diagnosed? One of my favorite things that has happened in recent years is that depression and mental illness in general is being talked about more and more. People are much more open with discussing it. But as a side effect of that, there's another problem. People have begun diagnosing themselves or over-diagnosing problems. And so where they're actually just in grieving, let's say, they think they have clinical depression. So it's important to be diagnosed by a mental health professional who will conduct an interview and possibly a physical examination to identify specific symptoms, medical and family history, cultural factors, and environmental factors to arrive at a diagnosis and a plan of action. Symptoms must also last for at least 2 weeks for a diagnosis of depression. There's a lot of things that can mimic depression too, such as medical conditions, thyroid problems, a brain tumor, or a vitamin deficiency, which is another reason why it is so important to get a diagnosis from somebody who knows this stuff inside and out. Dr. Google can only do so much, and especially when it comes to pursuing treatment, you don't want to pursue treatment in the wrong direction because you misdiagnosed the problem. Fortunately, for those people with depression, depression is among one of the most treatable mental disorders. Between 80% to 90% of people with depression eventually respond well to treatment, and almost all patients gain some relief from their symptoms. Now, I said we're going to tackle some of the misconceptions about depression. And one of the biggest is that being depressed or sad momentarily is not the same thing as having clinical depression. So the death of a loved one, loss of a job, or the ending of a relationship are difficult experiences for anyone to go through, and it's normal to feel sadness or grief during these times. Both grief and depression may involve intense sadness and withdrawal from usual activities, but there's also a couple of key differences. In grief, painful feelings come in waves, often intermixed with positive memories of the deceased, whereas in major depression, mood and interest are decreased for most, if not all, of the 2 weeks. In grief, self-esteem is usually maintained, whereas in major depression, feelings of worthlessness and self-loathing are common. I'll give you an example of this. Recently, my childhood dog passed away. I've had her since I was 7 up until 2 years after I graduated college, to give you an example of just how much she's been a part of my life and my family's life. And when she died, I felt grief. I felt pangs of sadness whenever I would instinctively glance over to where she should be sleeping up and waking up when I came down in the morning and she wasn't there, or when I made sure to close the gate so she wouldn't run out and realizing, she's not there. But all of these pangs of sadness and grief were intermixed with the happy memories that I had of her. The way that she would tilt her head all funny to the side when I scratched her ear, or the way she would chase her tail until she fell over. And at no point during the grieving process did I blame myself or say that because she's gone now, am somehow worth less. All right. So there is a difference between sadness, which is situational and tied to a specific event, and clinical depression, which is, it's not specific. It's a very broad, long-lasting ordeal. Depression also tends to look different in different sexes. Emphasis on tends to sometimes. Women have depression more often than men. Biological, life cycle, and hormonal factors unique to women may be linked to higher depression rates. Women with depression typically have symptoms of sadness, worthlessness, and guilt, whereas men with depression are more likely to be very tired, irritable, and sometimes angry. I want to emphasize that depression is depression. Okay, if you are a man with depression and you have symptoms of sadness, worthlessness, and guilt, it does not mean you have a woman's depression, and vice versa for women. It's just that sometimes, typically, the different symptoms will manifest more depending on the sex. Another thing is, tragically, many men do not recognize their depression and fail to seek help. There's a lot behind that. I think part of the reason why men do not recognize their depression and seek help is because there's this ideal a lot of men feel like they have to live up to, where they have to be confident and self-assured and independent. And so if you have feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness, well, that's not confidence. So then they take that to mean that it's a problem with their masculinity, and therefore they need to work on their masculinity and not necessarily seek treatment for mental illness. If they feel compelled to uphold a standard of independence, even if it's a standard that nobody can or should live up to, that independence can make them say, well, I'm not going to seek help because that means I'll be dependent on someone else. I can do this all on my own. I want to emphasize that, depression is a mental illness. And I know I've talked about this a bit with Amber, that mental illness in the medical community nowadays might not be the best term because it might continue the stigma that it's a mental illness. But I also want to emphasize that being a mental illness, it is something that is very real. It's not all in your head. It's not something that you can man up out of. It's not something that you can rub some dirt on and get over. You wouldn't tell somebody who has cancer to just get over it. You wouldn't tell somebody with a broken leg to just man up and walk on it, So when it comes to depression, it's very important to realize that it is very real and it needs serious treatment, and that it doesn't make you as a man any less of a man or any less capable to go and seek treatment. Very important. Depression also looks different in different ages. Older adults with depression may have less obvious symptoms, or they may be less likely to emit feelings of sadness or grief. They're also more likely to have medical conditions such as heart disease, which may contribute or cause depression. Younger children with depression may pretend to be sick, refuse to go to school, cling to a parent, or worry that a parent might die. And older children and teens with depression may get into trouble at school, sulk, and be irritable. Teens with depression may have symptoms of other disorders as well, such as anxiety, eating disorders, or substance abuse. Now, take all of these with a grain of salt, right? Because we should take depression seriously, but we should also make sure that depression comes with a professional diagnosis, because sometimes people can behave in these ways without actually having depression, right? I'll give you an example. Younger children with depression may pretend to be sick or refuse to go to school. There were a decent amount of times as a child where I pretended to be sick, but it wasn't because of depression. It was because we had just bought a new video game and my brothers hadn't played it yet, and I wanted to be the first one to play it, and we had video game time limits, so I knew if I stayed home sick that day, I would get to play not just for 45 minutes, I could play for hours and hours. I could hold it over my brother's head like, I played the video game before you, and it had nothing to do with depression. So keep that in mind, that each one of these things, even though it helps to recognize depression, knowing these symptoms, ultimately seek a mental health professional's professional opinion, professional diagnosis. So what does the depressed brain look like? Turns out a lot more complicated than I thought it would be. There's a lot of factors at work here. The first thing that we have to break through is the notion that depression is a chemical imbalance, pure and simple. Turns out that recent researchers show that depression doesn't spring from simply having too many or too few of certain brain chemicals. There are a lot of possible causes of depression, including faulty mood regulation by the brain, genetic vulnerability, stressful life events, medications, and medical problems, which means two people might have the same symptoms of depression, but two very different causes, which means two very different kinds of treatment. One person might just need a vitamin supplement, vitamin B12, for example. The other person might need more neural connectivity in their hippocampus, as we'll get into soon. This means that depression is incredibly individualized, and you can't go just off the symptoms of depression to diagnose the type of depression that they have. The amygdala in your brain plays a big role in depression as well. The amygdala is associated with emotions such as anger, pleasure, sorrow, fear, and sexual arousal. The amygdala is activated when a person recalls emotionally charged memories, such as a frightening situation, a traumatic memory, for example. And the activity in the amygdala is higher when a person is sad or clinically depressed. Now, for those of you who were a part of the last relevant conversation on the mind-body connection, we also learned how the amygdala will send the same stress response when you repeatedly revisit a stressful or traumatic memory again and again. Now, combine that with the fact that a lot of depressed people tend to ruminate. They tend to revisit certain memories again and again and again. And then you have this cycle of depression and digging themselves deeper into this pit of despair and hopelessness and worthlessness. So activity in the amygdala is higher when a person is sad or clinically depressed, which might mean more of those stress chemicals descending. Then there's the hippocampus. The hippocampus plays a central role in processing long-term memory and recollection. Research suggests that ongoing exposure to the stress hormone impairs new nerve cell growth in the hippocampus, which would explain why the hippocampus is smaller in some depressed people. Mind you, it is some depressed people, not all depressed people. So if you meet a depressed person, don't go thinking, oh, they've got a tiny hippocampus, because maybe not. In fact, animal studies show antidepressants spur growth and increased branching of nerve cells in the hippocampus, which means that future depression medications, instead of adding more serotonin to your brain chemicals, could promote neurogenesis instead, which would strengthen nerve cell connections and improve the exchange of information between nerve circuits. So to give you an example of this that's a bit more practical, for me, sometimes I find that revisiting life-affirming or happy memories can help combat my depression. But imagine trying to do that without the neural infrastructure and neural connectivity. It would be like trying to have a bunch of cars travel on roads that don't exist anymore, which is why neurogenesis could potentially be such a powerful treatment for depression. It allows people to reconnect with long-term memories and recall times that they were happy. And that's, I think, one of the toughest things about having depression is the way that depression will seem to sometimes rewrite history using phrases particularly like always, never, and sometimes it'll throw this tricky word in there like really. So it'll say something like, oh, well, you've never been happy, right? If you've never been happy, if that is true, which is not, but if you've never been happy, then what are the odds that you'll be happy in the future? So then that phrase can justify your hopelessness. Well, I've never been happy before, therefore there's little chance I'll be happy in the future, so why bother trying to get better? It's not going to happen. If you have trouble remembering those memories when you were happy, then that phrase goes unchallenged. So your brain, if all it can remember is the sad times, the bad times, then it really does seem like your life is suffering, even though that's not the case at all. That is why neurogenesis is so important as a depression treatment. Genes also play a role in depression. Genes make proteins that involve biological processes. Throughout life, different genes turn on and off so that they make the right proteins at the right times. But if genes get it wrong, they can alter your biology in a way that makes your mood become unstable. And a person who is already genetically vulnerable to depression, any stress can push this system off balance. Kind of like somebody who is, let's say, squatting on the ground, you try to push them over, they've got a firm stance, so they won't fall over so easily. But if you've got somebody who's balancing on the tips of their toes, it only takes a little tap to knock them over. That's how it is with people who are genetically vulnerable to depression. However, even this doesn't quite lead us to a simple solution, because mood is affected by dozens and dozens of genes. And so as our genetics differ, so do our depressions. In the future, researchers hope to pinpoint the genes involved in mood disorders to better understand their functions and create depression treatments that are more individualized and more successful. To give you an idea of just how our genes influence us, there is a gene called the serotonin transporter gene. You get one from your mother and one from your father. They can either be short or long. If you have two long versions of the gene, congratulations, you will be much less vulnerable to depression. But if you have two short versions, comparatively, you will be much more vulnerable. Temperament also plays a role in depression. Fortunately, it's not all genetics, right? So it's not all predetermined. It's not that you've been born with certain genetics and therefore there's no changing it. Nurture also plays a role as well as nature. So how excitable you are or whether you tend to withdraw from or engage in social situations is determined by your genes, yes, but also by the experiences you've had during the course of your life. Some people are better able to make better choices in life once they appreciate their habitual reactions to people and life events. Now, this is something we touched on a little bit in the mind-body connection talk. And we're going to see its increasing importance when it comes to handling mental health, which basically is the more aware you are of your emotions, your moods, and how you react to the world, the better you will be able to handle your mental illness. Part of this is because with things like depression, the depression feels too big to tackle. It feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. But if you can narrow it down to a specific memory, a specific trigger, suddenly the problem is not the size of the world. It's much smaller. It's very specific. And now you can face it head on using certain kinds of therapies. How quickly you can bounce back from a failure or a loss can also affect depression. Some people are very resilient. They hit rock bottom and bounce right back up like a basketball. Other people shatter on impact and they spend the next weeks, months, or years picking up the pieces of themselves. So temperament and resilience matter. In fact, cognitive psychologists point out that your view of the world, and in particular, your unacknowledged assumptions about how the world works, can also influence how you feel. This is not something that we may be conscious of either. We tend to develop our viewpoints early on and we automatically fall back on them whenever any kind of loss, disappointment, or rejection occurs. As human beings, we don't like uncertainty. We don't like not having the answers. We like to know if something happened to us, especially if something bad happened to us, we want to know why. We want to know why so we can make sense of it, and we want to know why so we can make sure it never happens again. But if our unacknowledged assumptions are unhealthy, then it could lead to a more depressed state. So for example, if your unacknowledged assumption of the world is everyone oppresses everyone else, then anytime something bad happens to you, you're going to feel singled out and oppressed rather than just, taking a deep breath and saying, okay, well, sometimes bad things happen. This too shall pass, and I'm going to move on. To give you another example, you may come to see yourself as unworthy of love, so you may avoid getting into a relationship with someone because you're afraid to lose it. So basically, you are so afraid of either getting rejected or falling in love and then getting your heart broken that you decide to reject them before they ever reject you. And then later down the line, when the memory isn't necessarily so fresh, you might say, well, why didn't we get together? And your brain will chime in, oh, well, it's because they just didn't like you, and a lot of people don't like you. And so you're not worth that much, really. Or you may be so self-critical that you can't bear the slightest criticism from others, which can slow or block your career path. Trauma also affects depression. Researchers have found that early losses and emotional trauma may leave individuals more vulnerable to depression later in life. Particularly profound early losses, such as the death of a parent or the withdrawal of a loved one's affection, may resonate throughout life, eventually expressing themselves as depression. When an individual is unaware of the wellspring of their illness, they can't easily move past the depression. There's that awareness again. Unless the person gains a conscious understanding of the source of their condition, later losses or disappointments may trigger its return. So let's take the first example. The withdrawal of a loved one's affection. Let's say it was one of your parents. So it's an authority figure. And then you go throughout life striving above all to get the approval from authority figures, whether it's your boss or somebody, let's just say it's your boss. and they turn you down for a position you've requested, or they turn you down for a project you want to get involved in, you may take that personally because of your unexamined assumptions about that may relate to the depression you've had about your parent withdrawing their love from you. And so if you continually get rejected by authority figures, you may take it more personally than you would otherwise if you had a conscious understanding of the source of your condition. If you say, okay, well, hold on a minute. Yes, this person is in a position of authority, and yes, I would like their approval, but their approval is not the only thing that matters. You might be able to then work through that. Medical problems, medical illnesses, and medications may be at the root of up to 10 to 15% of all depressions. So for example, there's hypothyroidism, a condition where your body produces too little thyroid hormone, which can lead to exhaustion and depression. This can mimic depression because, as we touched on earlier, depressed people tend to be very tired, very fatigued a lot of the time, if not all of the time, which is another reason why they sleep a lot. Heart disease has also been linked to depression, with up to half of heart attack survivors reporting feeling blue and many having significant depression, which is not all that surprising. If somebody has had a heart attack, that is probably their first brush with death. It's not that they've never considered it before. It's not that they thought they would live forever, but that is the first smack in the face, so to speak, reminding them of their own mortality. It's like that moment when you're taking an exam and you know you don't have all the time in the world to take it, but suddenly the teacher says, you've got 1 minute left, and then put your pencils down, you're done. Again, you knew you wouldn't have unlimited time left, but it's over a lot sooner than you thought it would be. It can be jarring to a lot of people. The scary thing, though, is that depression is linked with slower recovery, future cardiovascular trouble, and a higher risk of dying within about 6 months. So think about that for a second. Heart disease is linked to depression, with heart attack survivors falling into a significant depression, and that depression makes them more at risk to have another heart attack, which would make them more depressed, and on and on and on. So then you have this devastating cycle of heart attack, depression, depression, heart attack. And, you know, that's why, in addition to treating the body of the patient, we also have to treat the mind. Other medical problems that I can't go into because it would take too long are degenerative neurological conditions such as multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and Huntington's disease can contribute or are associated with depression. Stroke, nutritional deficiencies such as a lack of vitamin B12, certain immune system diseases such as lupus, viruses and other infections such as mononucleosis, hepatitis, HIV, cancer, and erectile dysfunction in men can all contribute to depression or are associated with it. Okay, so now we understand a bit more about how depression works in the brain. How do we treat it, though? Because as we've seen, depression can have a lot of different causes. First and foremost, of course, get a diagnosis from a healthcare professional. Besides that, I think the best thing you can do to start is lifestyle modifications. This is the least invasive, and it's something you can do right now from home. For many people, regular exercise helps create positive feelings and improve mood, partly from the release of feel-good chemicals like endorphins, and partly because, depending on the exercises you're doing, you might look in the mirror and say, damn, I'm looking good, and that can boost your self-esteem. Another important factor for lifestyle modifications is getting enough quality sleep on a regular basis, eating a healthy diet, and avoiding depressants like alcohol. Now, let me break down the sleep. It is not enough to get the requisite 8 hours of sleep if you're sleeping poorly. And it is very important to get consistently good quality sleep and enough hours of sleep. In college, I did what many college students do, which is very unhealthy, and that is you get like 4 hours of sleep on Thursday night, and you're feeling exhausted, so you say, okay, well, I'm going to make up for it on the weekend, and then you sleep 13 hours. And it messes up your sleep schedule. Suddenly your body doesn't have a routine of when it's supposed to get tired, when it's supposed to go to sleep, when it's supposed to wake up. It's all up in the air. And you know, as a young adult, young adults are typically not too keen on routine and structure in their lives. But when it comes to sleep, it is very important to have a reliable sleep schedule. Look at people who travel a lot by plane, who are jet lagged. Their sleep schedule is all out of whack. They're very tired. Their mood's all over the place. You've got to get good quality sleep on a consistent basis and eat a healthy diet. We talked about that a bit more in the mind-body connection last week. Cheeseburgers, don't cut it. Make sure you're getting good dietary fiber, amino acids, healthy fats, things like that. There's also talk therapy. Psychotherapy or talk therapy is sometimes used alone for treatment of mild depression, and for moderate or severe depression, psychotherapy is often used along with antidepressant medications. In my case, it was the latter. I was put on some SSRIs. I was put on Lexapro and I don't remember if this is an SSRI, Trazodone, and I was undergoing talk therapy, which was very, very helpful. If there is one thing that y'all should do, it's definitely talk therapy. Talk therapy is amazing. And I used to say, as many people do, that, why do I need to do talk therapy? I've got my best friend or I've got my significant other to talk to about these sorts of things. Well, there's a couple of reasons why you should go see a licensed therapist. First of all, no matter how much research your significant other or best friend has done, I promise you the mental health professional definitely knows more and they can help you better. Secondly, what are you going to do if your significant other or your best friend are part of the problem you need to talk to somebody about? So for example, if one of the problems you're having in your relationship is that you're starting to fall out of love with them, you can't exactly take that up with your significant other unless you want to be called a sociopath. Like, hey, honey, I got to talk to you. I don't feel anything for you anymore. Like, no, so you've got to have somebody who understands the inner workings of the mind, who can keep things confidential. Maybe you trust your best friend, your best friend, but like they can always tell somebody else what you've told them. Licensed psychiatrists are forbidden from doing that. And, you can talk to them about absolutely anything at all. And if they're good, they won't judge you for it. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been found to be effective in treating depression. It is a form of therapy focused on the present and problem solving. All right, let's take this apart real quick. Focus on the present is very important for people with depression because all too often you're stuck revisiting the past again and again and again. And that can just stick you in this nasty mire where it's hard to escape from. And cognitive behavioral therapy can take you out of that process of revisiting the past and root you back in the present. And if you've got anxiety, it can take you from worrying about the future back into the present. Another thing it does is it helps you solve the problem. So remember, when it comes to depression, people often feel worthless and hopeless. They might have this sense of learned helplessness where they feel like maybe it is something that can be overcome, but not by me. I just don't have it in me. By turning it into a problem you can solve, it says on some level that it's solvable. Therefore, there is hope. It can be solved in the future. Therefore, the future can be better. It helps combat some of that hopelessness. And because you are the one solving it alongside a therapist, since you are the one solving it, it helps combat some of that feeling of helplessness, because then it's not somebody else swooping in and rescuing you. You are the one helping yourself. So you say, well, you know what? Maybe I can tackle this. Maybe I can get better. There's hope down the road, and I've got some power in me to solve this problem. Cognitive behavioral therapy also helps a person recognize distorted thinking and then change their behaviors and thought processes. So it can help you break that nasty cycle of I'm worthless, therefore I can't do anything. I can't do anything, therefore I'm worthless, going around and around and around again. It helps you identify your thoughts and emotions, and it helps you break them down, reanalyze them, and reinterpret them in a much more positive way. I highly recommend it. Granted, because I underwent this alongside medications, I can't say which was the more helpful, but I will say just with general negative thoughts that come up, both with anxiety and depression, cognitive behavioral therapy is extremely helpful. And you don't even have to wait until you're feeling the full force of your depression or anxiety to go talk to somebody. For me, what I would do is I would write down what I was feeling during the times when it was worst, and then I would bring it into my therapist the next day. Antidepressants, also very helpful. Antidepressants such as SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, might be prescribed to help modify brain chemistry. These medications are not sedatives, uppers, or tranquilizers. They are not habit-forming, and generally, antidepressant medications have no stimulating effect on people not experiencing depression, which is why you won't walk into a club and see people popping antidepressant medication. You know, it's just, it doesn't have a stimulating effect on people not experiencing depression. Although I will say one side effect that's been pretty well documented is your sex drive takes a hit. So that is one side effect that's not altogether pleasant. Now, there's a couple of breakthrough treatments, but I want to focus on one of the ones that to me was the most fascinating for depression. Psilocybin. Psilocybin is a compound found in magic mushrooms, which spoken out loud in the United States seems ridiculous, but we have to remember that for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, all across the world, civilizations used magic mushrooms and their psychedelic compounds both for religious and spiritual rituals as well as medicine. Most recently, after many decades of the war on drugs criminalizing psilocybin and psychoactive compounds, the FDA has realized that it has medicinal properties, and they've granted breakthrough therapy status to psilocybin therapy in still ongoing clinical trials, which are looking to psilocybin's potential to treat severe treatment-resistant depression or depression in patients who have not improved after undergoing 2 different antidepressant treatments. There's a couple things to keep in mind here. First off, these trials are still ongoing. Results are still coming in. They need to be a lot more widespread, as we'll see in a second, but they are incredibly promising. Second, this is psilocybin therapy. This is not somebody just, taking it for the fun of it, laying on their couch. They have a therapist with them, a medical professional who plays the role of what would historically be a shaman, where they guide the person through the psychedelic experience and help them reinterpret their thought processes and beliefs. A 2016 Johns Hopkins University study of 51 patients with life-threatening cancer showed high doses of psilocybin significantly reduced end-of-life depression and anxiety for 6 months in 80% of cases and helped patients accept death. A similar study done by the New York University showed similar results. Now, this to me is fascinating, and I've got a lot of hope for it. Granted, we can say, okay, 51 patients, not a great sample size when trying to, when studying the effects of a unknown compound or not very studied compound like psilocybin. But for people who are, facing their own mortality, life-threatening cancer, 80% of them having significantly reduced depression and anxiety with a single dose of psilocybin, that's incredible. That is amazing. Because part of the thing you want in medicine is you want something that has as few side effects as possible, hopefully none. And you want something that they can take as little of it as possible with the best benefit. You don't want to be carting around a giant carton of medical pills that's their own meal just to take them. Ideally, if you can have something small like a single dose of psilocybin that can significantly reduce anxiety and depression, that's wonderful. And we have fMRI scans to back this up. These fMRI scans of patients' brains after taking psilocybin showed reduced blood flow and resting activity in the amygdala, which is often overactive in depression and anxiety. They also showed looser connections between brain networks, which then reintegrate and what researchers suggest is a part of the brain's so-called resetting itself. This may explain why the drug drives some patients to rethink entrenched beliefs and break compulsive thought patterns and behaviors. All right. If you have this entrenched belief that you are worthless and hopeless, you are not worth helping, you are not worth listening to, you are a burden to yourself and everyone else around you, and it would be better to just get it over with, this drug could help you rethink these entrenched beliefs and break these compulsive thought patterns and behaviors and lead you to a more positive state of mind. To give you an example of just how connected the brain can become from a single dose of psilocybin, on the left, we have different areas of the brain talking to each other. And on the right, on a placebo, on the right, we have the different regions of the brain talking to each other on psilocybin. Now, to me, this really struck home because on the last talk, we talked about just how powerful a placebo could be. So we covered this in the last talk, but for those of you who weren't there, people on a placebo who were told they were getting morphine had as much pain relief as people who actually took morphine. So the placebo effect is incredibly powerful. And yet, comparatively with psilocybin, it's done almost nothing at all. Each one of those dots that you see on the edge is a different region of the brain. Each one of those lines is that the signal from that region of the brain connecting to another region of the brain. Part of the reason why scientists believe that psilocybin can help people rethink these entrenched beliefs is because it is literally hyper-connecting the brain to different parts of itself that it has never been connected to before. That said, there is still a lot of work and research to do on psilocybin. There is some promise, of course, because common antidepressants seem to dull emotions to help people cope. Psilocybin works on our serotonin system to heighten emotional responses and encourage people to actively confront their depression, which can prompt these enduring shifts of mind I was talking about. And this is one of the fascinations with scientists and people in the medical field with psilocybin, because it seems like the opposite of what you want, doesn't it? Antidepressants dull emotions and the negativity and all that kind of stuff to help people cope. It seems counterintuitive that you'd want to heighten those kinds of things, and yet it seems like helping people face them can help them get over them. That said, they are not recommended, especially in higher doses, for people with a family history of psychosis for fear that the drug could trigger latent schizophrenia. And even psilocybin's fiercest proponents agree that it will take a lot more evidence of its effectiveness on larger groups in controlled settings and investigation into its potential adverse effects before it can be used as a common commercial medicine. So again, a lot of promise here, but we need more information, and it's still extremely illegal. Okay, so don't take a bunch of mushrooms and then tell the cops Ryan said you could. Okay, I'm not saying that. It's very illegal, but very promising as a medicine. So because that's illegal, how can you help someone with depression? The same way you can help yourself with depression, which is to go see a healthcare provider and a mental health professional and get a diagnosis. Not just getting the diagnosis that, yes, you have depression, but what specifically might be causing it. Then, if you know somebody with depression, offer support, understanding, patience, and encouragement. A depressed person typically may feel they are worthless or hopeless. So you have to supplement them with hope. You have to give them hope when they have none. You have to affirm their self-worth when they feel worthless. And you have to be really, really understanding, right? We are learning about the general symptoms of depression, the way they manifest themselves. We were also learning that depression manifests differently in different people, or it can look the same but have different causes. So don't assume that because you've done your research or because you've even that you're here listening to this talk that you understand their depression. The best way to help someone with any mental illness, in this case depression, is to listen to them talk, encourage them to open up, and then once they do so, to use active listening strategies to show them that you care. So don't be on your phone if they're opening up to you. Don't be working on something and kind of occasionally glancing over to listen to what they're saying and then turning back to what you're doing. Don't interrupt them. And that's very important. I will say, don't interrupt them, and don't finish their sentences. You have to be patient, because people in general, but especially people with depression, they find it hard to open up because they feel like they're not worth listening to, and because they're not worth anything, therefore they're wasting your time and they're being a burden. So you have to be patient with them. You have to be understanding of where they're coming from, and you have to be patient that they're going to get their thoughts out. I think it was Dr. Jordan Peterson, a psychiatrist, who said that oftentimes when somebody opens up to you like this, they may not be super articulate yet, because this may be the first time they are thinking these thoughts out loud and they're still working through them. So even if they take a minute, even if they're tripping over their words, please do not offer up suggestions unless they ask for it. Do not interrupt them. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't try to fill in the blanks. If they're having trouble, encourage them to continue. Sometimes you'll see this thing where they go like, never mind, forget about it. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. Forget it. That's kind of code for I'm wasting your time. I'm being a burden. Encourage them to continue. Reassure them you're listening. You're here for them. You want to hear what they have to say, and then actively listen. Never ignore comments about suicide, and report them to your loved one's healthcare provider or therapist. Invite them out for walks, outings, and other activities. I will say on the side of the sort of going out for walks, let's say, being in nature can be a huge mood booster. Getting physical activity, not necessarily running, but even just walking can be a good mood booster. But in general, inviting someone out with you who's depressed can say, yes, we love you. Yes, we care about you. In fact, we care enough about you that we're not going to leave you at home by yourself. We want you to be a part of our life. We want to share these experiences with you. So invite them out. Make sure they know they are loved, they are appreciated, they are wanted. Help them adhere to the treatment plan, such as setting reminders to take prescribed medications, and help ensure that they have transportation to therapy appointments. Remind them in time, with treatment, their depression will lift. I cannot emphasize enough, when somebody feels hopeless, you have to be their hope. You have to supplement them with hope. When they feel worthless, you have to reaffirm their self-worth. It is really hard to take care of yourself if you don't think you're worth anything. So you have to remind them that they are worth helping, and it is going to get better. And if you have depression, I think one of the single best pieces of advice that have helped me comes again from Dr. Jordan Peterson, when he said to treat yourself as if you are someone you are responsible for taking care of. And he brought up all these different facts and figures about how a person, people tend to be much more on top of things when it comes to giving their pets medication than they are on top of things when it comes to giving themselves medication. And when it comes to people who have depression, they don't think very highly of themselves. They're intensely aware of their negative thoughts, which can talk a lot louder than their positive thoughts. They're intensely aware of their mistakes. So sometimes you have to step outside yourself and say, okay, well, maybe emotionally, I don't see myself as somebody worth taking care of. But if I were somebody I was responsible for taking care of, what would I say to them? How would I treat them? If they're really overwhelmed, would I tell them to take a deep breath, take a break, do something they love instead of pushing themselves harder and harder? Okay, well, let me tell that to myself now. Treat yourself as if you are responsible for someone you are taking care of. And remember, depression does not make you weak. It is a very real condition. Depression cannot be overcome by telling a person to just cheer up, to smile more, to man up, to rub some dirt on it and get over it. It's like telling a person with a broken leg to just get over it. It's just not going to work. Depression is complex, and the road to getting help and feeling better can be incredibly complex too. It requires patience, hope, and plenty of emotional support and understanding. Next, we have Generalized Anxiety Disorder. Hold on. Okay, also abbreviated as GAD, which just sounds weird. Close to 7 million people are affected by GAD, meaning they experience excessive anxiety symptoms more days than not for over 6 months, which may include sleeplessness, restlessness, irritability, and muscle tension. The tension from carrying the stress in their muscles. All of this can lead to chronic fatigue. So imagine a time when you were super, super stressed, just in general, not anxiety, but super stressed, on the ball, let's say during a hurricane evacuation or something like that, when your fight or flight is kicked into overdrive. After a full day of that, you feel pretty tired, don't you? Well, when it comes to people with generalized anxiety disorder, they can have this feeling all of the time, and it is very, very draining. It also, like depression, exists on a spectrum. It can be very mild or it can be totally debilitating. So some people experience anxiety at the idea of getting up in front of a classroom and to turn their paper into the teacher. And that's really as far as their anxiety goes. Whereas other people might have such difficult anxiety that they have trouble leaving their house. Anxiety, I want to emphasize, is very unreasonable. It's excessive, it's persistent, it's unreasonable. It doesn't quite make sense, which is why cognitive behavioral therapy is incredibly effective for treating it, because when you aren't focused on the reason why you're anxious, it can seem completely unbeatable and abstract. So, for example, well, honestly, that was a personal example when I talked about getting up in front of the class to turn in a paper. I used to have that with just about everything. Getting up in front of anybody, I would be incredibly anxious, so much so that I would be in, an hour and a half long class in college, and I knew people could get up at any time to go to the bathroom, but to me, the thought of getting up to go to the bathroom in front of people, just walking across, it filled me with this feeling of, oh my God, I can't do that. I can't do that. That'd be, and after I did some cognitive behavioral therapy, I realized how unreasonable it was. I challenged it. Like what did I think was going to happen? That all the students would look up at once and be like, "Where are you going?" Or the teacher would, see me leaving and he's like, "No," and throw down his chalk and say, "This is just too much. I can't. You sit back down in your seat." Like, I didn't know what I thought would happen, but the idea of getting up in front of the class and walking out of the classroom, it was incomprehensible to me. I would just sit there and be like, I gotta wait till the end of class, even if I really, really had to go. It's terrible. It's also twice as prevalent in females as males. Also, stress is not the same as anxiety. Regular stress is situational and often helpful. I want to make this distinction in particular because, like I said earlier, this wonderful increased awareness of mental health has also led to people sometimes seeing mental illness where there is no mental illness. So, for example, in my generation, I've noticed that some people equate stress with anxiety like an anxiety disorder, and so they will avoid anything related to any stress at all. And that's not only is that not helpful, it's actually detrimental, because there are plenty of things in life that are worth doing that will cause stress. In fact, I'd wager that if you're doing anything in life that you really care about, there's going to be some stress about it because you want to do it well. You're not going to eliminate that by avoiding it. On the contrary, you might just strengthen the stress and create an anxiety around it because you're telling yourself that it is something that should be avoided. Stress is normal and situational. It is tied to specific instances. So, for example, if you're about to speak in front of people, you want to have that heightened awareness so that you can notice and respond to changes in the environment. If you're about to submit an article to a magazine or a newspaper or a resume to a new job opening that you really care about, stress might make you check over your work one more time to make sure there's no sneaky little grammatical errors hidden in there. Stress is very different from anxiety. Panic attacks are also different from anxiety, although they can feel symptomatically the same depending on how severe the anxiety is. Panic attacks are sudden, short episodes of intense fear that trigger severe physical reactions like a rapid heart rate, shortness of breath, dizziness, and it can happen to anyone, anywhere, whether they have an anxiety disorder or not. And sometimes the trigger isn't always obvious. I'll give you an example. One time, I was heading home from work. I had a good day at work. Everything was going fine. Emotionally, should have been normal. I stopped to get a burrito from my favorite taco place. Got my burrito, went to my car. I was about to head home, put my burrito in the seat next to me, closed the door, turned on the AC, turned on music. And right then, I had this feeling inside like I had been stuffed into a sleeping bag head first and tossed into a river. Everything felt too close. I felt like I couldn't breathe, and it didn't make any sense, which was more terrifying because when I put my finger against my neck, I could feel my heartbeat was fast, but not too fast. And I was like, I'm surrounded by air. I should be fine. I cracked the window, plenty of air coming past, and yet it felt like there was not enough air in the world to keep me breathing. And it was miserable. My heart was going, it was miserable. But thankfully, it was short-lived. And it was all but gone by the time I got home. Okay, so let's talk about what generalized anxiety disorder is. If it's not a panic attack and it's not general stress, what is it? Well, there is a genetic component to it. For starters, 40% of people with it have a relative who has it too. Those with anxiety disorders often show an overactive amygdala and periaqueductal gray area, which can have a negative impact on our brains and our bodies. So, for example, in a study of 300 people over 5 years, those with overactive amygdalas had a higher incidence of heart disease, which can lead to depression, which can lead to more heart disease, higher incidence of heart disease, as the overactive amygdala can trigger an increase in white blood cells in the bone marrow, which can lead to inflammation, which can lead to an increased buildup of fatty deposits in your arteries. Now that is just reading that, I'm a little bit stressed. Not anxious, but stressed. Fortunately, there are things that we can do for anxiety disorders. But first, we have to understand just how deep the genetic component goes, because this absolutely floored me, this experiment. When researchers shocked lab mice after exposing them to the smell of fruit, the mice began to fear the smell of fruit, expecting a shock. Now that part makes sense. But these mice's future generations were also afraid of the smell of fruit, even though they had never been shocked the way their parents had. Their parents' experience led to the overexpression of certain odor receptors, which was passed down genetically. Now, this fascinated me because it's not like the parents were in one corner and the babies were in the other, and they saw their parents get shocked, and they said, when they got shocked, I smelled strawberries. Therefore, strawberries may lead to me getting shocked in the future, right? They weren't around then. They weren't even in their mother's wombs experiencing this subconsciously. They had no way to know that the smell of fruit would lead to a later shock. No way at all. And yet this was genetically expressed in them later on because their parents' odor receptors adapted to be more sensitive to the smell of fruit. Okay. Thankfully, there's treatment for this. It is not all doom and gloom of, well, genetically you have it and therefore you can't get rid of it. It's all in your genes. There is a lot of things we can do. The best one being cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on identifying, challenging, and then neutralizing or reinterpreting unhelpful or distorted thoughts underlying anxiety disorders. So we don't live our lives with a logical A to B memories of this happened, which led to that, which led to that, which led to that, which led to that. We are constantly weaving narratives and stories, which, if we're not careful, and if we have depression or an anxiety disorder, can be stories that ultimately make our lives more miserable. So, for example, if you have a thought running in the background saying, I can't do anything right, that can make you less likely to pursue opportunities at work or in your personal life because, well, if you can't do anything right, what's the chance that you'll actually succeed? But if you become aware of that thought, you can challenge it and turn it into everyone makes mistakes, including me. Now, I will say mental illness, depression, and anxiety, they're very tricky because if it was as simple as these two things, as a simple two-step statement, that it would be a lot easier to solve. I'll give you an example using me. So I've had this thought a lot of I can't do anything right anytime I make a mistake. I challenge it. I turn it into everyone makes mistakes, including me. And then another thought comes in which says, well, yes, everyone makes mistakes, but do you really want to be like everyone if you can be better? And that's fueled by my perfectionist attitude of trying to perfect everything I do so I never fail. One thing that's really helped me combat that is something my psychologist, the therapist I had in college, said to me. She said, Ryan, you are not a table, which sounds really weird. You are not a table. But like, no kidding, I'm not a table. I mean, last I checked, I'm a human, right? But she said to me, look at a table and it's got fixed dimensions. It is always what it is. It never changes. You can measure it one day and the next day it'll be exactly the same. Human beings aren't like that. So, in my case, I was having a lot of different avenues I was extending my perfectionist mindset into. I wanted to be perfect in my mind. I wanted to be perfect in my body. I wanted to be perfect in my behavior. So for the body, I was like, okay, I always want to be this standard of physical fitness. And since I gorged on donuts yesterday because I was stressed, I have failed and I can't do anything right. Or I should have studied harder for that test. And even though there's a lot of other things at play that led to me maybe not getting such a good grade, such as something on the test that wasn't in the review that I didn't know we should have known about, I say, well, I can't do anything right. I could be a lot better at that. And so she would say, look, you're not a table, right? Your body is going to fluctuate from day to day. Some days you're going to weigh more than others. Some days your skin is not going to, it's not going to be as, you're not going to look as muscular or as sexy or whatever on a day-to-day basis. You can be very productive one day, but you're not going to match your best day of productivity every single day. You are not a table. You are not a fixed entity. If you're going to try to be perfect, it's just not going to happen because you are human, not a table. And that really helped me. And I think it also helped because it's such a weird phrase that it just sticks in your head. There's also exposure therapy, which is where psychologists create a safe environment in which to expose individuals to things they fear or avoid. The exposure to the feared objects, activities, or situations in a safe way helps reduce fear and decrease avoidance. But it's not just about getting used to the fear. It's about retraining your brain to stop sending the fear signal when there isn't actually any danger. So imagine you had a fear of drowning. You wouldn't want to have somebody throw you into the middle of the ocean without a life vest. That's not a good way to expose yourself to your fear and overcome it. Instead, a psychologist might have you stand in the kiddie pool, which, depending on how severe your anxiety is, might actually feel ridiculous, or it might be pretty anxiety inducing. So you get comfortable with the water at your ankles, let's say. And then once you get comfortable with that and you retrain your brain at that level to stop sending the fear signal, you might go over to the bigger pool and you stand on the first step, up to your ankles still, but now you're facing the deeper parts of the pool, so you know what's coming, so there might be more anxiety with that. You get used to that, go down to the second step. Now the water's up to your knees. You get used to that, retrain your brain to stop sending fear signals. Another step, now the water is up to your waist, and so on and so forth until you retrain your brain to stop sending fear signals related to at least moderate amounts of water. Antidepressant medication also helps. Antidepressants are used to treat depression, as the name goes, but they can also be helpful for treating anxiety disorders. So for example, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and serotonin neuroepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, or SNRIs, are commonly used as first-line treatments for anxiety. For me, because the psychiatrist diagnosed me with both, these doubly help me, which is another thing I'll add in here, which is that if you find your medication working for your mental illness, don't stop taking it, all right? Especially not cold turkey. And if you're thinking about stopping taking it, please consult a medical professional about it so they can help you taper off them slowly. A couple months ago, I was trying to taper off my anti-anxiety medication because I was like, well, I'm good now, I'm good. So I went down to half a pill. Things were pretty okay there. I went off them completely, and I got what I called the jitters, which is with that like undercurrent of buzzing anxiety, of general freaking out, just because your body's like very uncomfortable. And it turns out that I should not have stopped taking my medication, just because, and I think the reason why people sometimes stop taking their medication when they're working is because they're no longer feeling the symptoms that make them say, oh my God, I should take my medication. So in my case anyways, I realized that going off my medication was not a good idea. Some people can suffer certain side effects, and some people can build up a tolerance to them. Then there's benzodiazepines, which, I'm not a medical health professional, but I wouldn't recommend these. These are things like Xanax, and they come with a lot of baggage. So they can aid in sleep and muscle relaxation, but they can increase risk for dementia in older populations. They are effective in relieving anxiety and take effect more quickly than antidepressant medications, which can sometimes take a couple of weeks for you to really start feeling a difference. But people can build up a tolerance to them if they're taken over a long period of time, and they may need higher and higher doses to get the same effect. Some people may even become dependent on them, and if they suddenly stop taking them, they may have withdrawal symptoms or their anxiety may return. Overall, I mean, if you have to, maybe, but I think first start with cognitive behavioral therapy and antidepressant medication. Okay, what else can you do to deal with anxiety? First of all, identify what's making you anxious, right? It is a lot harder to deal with this abstract, universe-sized panicking feeling, like everything is compressing you, and much easier to deal with a single situation or instance that might be triggering your anxiety. You also want to be aware of any substances that might be to blame, like caffeine. I can't tell you how many times I've been feeling anxious in the middle of the day. My heart's racing, my mind is bouncing around, I feel freaked out, and I'm like, oh my God, what could this be? What did I eat for breakfast? I had eggs, I had toast, I had 3 cups of coffee. Yeah, that'll do it. Okay. So then that might not, calm down the anxiety, but by giving it a specific source for why it's happening can make me feel more in control. Mindfulness meditation also helps a lot in much of the same way that cognitive behavioral therapy can. In this case, it takes the miserable subjective experience you're going through, and you can view it objectively from a non-judgmental perspective and view these feelings from a more detached perspective. Another thing you can do is get out of the physical space you are in right now and go for a walk. Especially right now during the coronavirus pandemic, where everybody's kind of cooped up, it's easy to get cabin fever and this feeling like, oh my God, I just got to get out of here. If I stay here, I can't. It's just too much. Go out, go for a walk, be in the wide open air, get moving, because if you're feeling jittery, it can help to give those jitters, that anxiety, like a physical manifestation. Give them something to work with. If you've got all this pent up energy vibrating around in you, give it some motion. Go for a walk, go for a run if you can. Another thing that I've heard about recently that really helped me out was when you feel anxiety, halt and ask yourself, am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I tired? Just like with caffeine, this may not necessarily help you combat the anxiety, but can give you a specific source for it that you can then work on. And if nothing else, then it can help explain it and make it feel less abstract and huge. So if you're hungry, you can eat something, ideally something nutritious. If you're angry, you can give that anger someplace to go by exercising, or you can do a calming meditation to find more peace of mind. If you're lonely, you can reach out to somebody that you know and love. You can text them, you can FaceTime them. And if you're tired, you can take a nap or go to bed earlier. You can become more aware of, okay, well, I feel very anxious, but how many hours of sleep did I get last night? So maybe I can't solve this this anxiety that's related to tiredness right now, but since I've been getting poor sleep, tonight I can do it better. I can go to bed earlier. I can get off my phone sooner. I can keep work-related activity out of my bed so my brain doesn't associate bed with work and therefore mental activity. Become aware of what might be causing your anxiety. Microtasking your day or any kind of task is also really helpful. Sometimes looking ahead at the full load of things we have to do can be incredibly, incredibly overwhelming. And breaking it down into smaller tasks helps. It's a bit like having a giant steak. You're not going to be able to cram the full thing in your mouth and chew, because then you will choke. But if you can cut it up into bite-sized pieces, that's a bit more manageable. And it seems less daunting when you look ahead at it. And also, don't beat yourself up if these tips don't work. sometimes you can't calm your anxiety. And I don't mean that in a fatalistic sense of, oh, there's nothing you can do about it, because there's plenty of things you can do about it, plenty of treatments you can do. But sometimes when I can't calm my anxiety, one of the things that really helps is saying to myself, this too shall pass. But for right now, this is just where I'm at. This is where I'm going to be for a little bit. And then sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes it's as if my anxiety was really just looking for attention, like, hey, hey, hey. And now that I've acknowledged it, it's like, oh, okay, well, thanks for noticing me. Now I'll just simmer down and quiet a bit. Talk to somebody about how you feel. Allow yourself to be vulnerable. Being vulnerable doesn't mean you're weak. It means you have the courage to open up. It is one of those things that I think nowadays people, it's like, people are terrified of heights, speaking in front of an audience, and being vulnerable. And yet being vulnerable, out of all three of those things, is the most beneficial to you and your well-being. Open up to people. I think, we, especially if you have anxiety, you have this erroneous notion that they're going to judge you and think of you worse for it. And in reality, in my experience, and a lot of the experience of people I know, what actually happens is you'll find that you're not the only one going through this. You're not the only one having these feelings. You're not the only one having these struggles. And so not only does it help to share those things with somebody to get it off your chest, but it also helps to know that you have other people who know exactly where you're coming from because they're just like you. It's very comforting. It's very common. Open up to people. Now we have post-traumatic stress disorder, and I would like to welcome our guest tonight, Amber Lonsdale. She is a marriage and family therapist at Luminous Life Therapy and a certified EMDR therapist. Amber, take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Okay, so Ryan asked me to be here to talk a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. I thought I would briefly touch on similarities and differences between PTSD and depression and anxiety that we just covered. It's important to note that is very often people have more than one issue that they're struggling with. And in the mental health field, we call that comorbidity, or co-occurring disorders. And so someone might have PTSD as well as depression, or they might have generalized anxiety as well as PTSD, or all three. And so it becomes part of the reason to seek professional help, to kind of help you sort out what is what and which experiences you can attribute to what things, so that you know how to proceed and how to get the best help. So some things that are similar with, just like depression, when you have PTSD, you often have a loss of interest, maybe feelings of hopelessness. Having a traumatic experience can kind of change and shift your lens, your view of the way that you see the world, your feeling of safety in general. Also, all very common with depression. Difficulty sleeping is almost always present with PTSD in various forms. Some people have very vivid and extreme nightmares. Other people don't sleep at all. Maybe they sleep 2 or 3 hours a night and then they're just up pacing. Similar to generalized anxiety, there's often a lot of fear involved. And so worry that happens partly as a mechanism of the brain, which we'll get into in a few minutes. But in addition to sort of changing your view and scope of how you see the world, your schema of the way that things might happen, your brain in that fight or flight response wants to anticipate anything similar to that negative or traumatic experience happening again. One of the things that Ryan asked me to touch on was misconceptions. And I think in my practice, one of the things I hear the most often is that it wasn't that bad. I shouldn't feel the way that I feel. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute when we talk about the brain function and why PTSD happens. First, I wanted to get to the symptoms that are PTSD specific. So with PTSD, and unlike other things, generally there is a sense of hypervigilance, meaning that the person that experienced the trauma, they are hyper aware of sights, sounds, smells, what's going on around them. Generally, we see a lot of needing to know where the exits are, wanting to sit with their back against the wall, safety related types of sensory perception that they are fixated on. Nightmares, like I mentioned before, but very specific to flashbacks and reliving the experience, whatever it was that was traumatic. And I should specify that when I say traumatic, what I mean by that is that it was something that was overwhelming to your nervous system at the time, something that it's more than your nervous system can handle in the moment that it's happening. And this is part of the reason that there is no such thing as bad enough. Avoidance is probably the other main PTSD specific symptom. People that have experienced PTSD will avoid anything that reminds them of the experience that was traumatic, whether that's a person, a place, a song, or even an emotion. We see a lot of dissociating symptoms with PTSD. And for those of you that aren't familiar, dissociating, the classic kind of severe would be like the movie Sybil, multiple personality disorders, or you're just kind of in an out of body experience. On a much simpler level, it's no different than driving somewhere and thinking to yourself, wow, I don't even remember how I got here, because you were sort of spacing off. That's dissociation. We all do it. We just do it to varying degrees. When you've experienced a trauma, you tend to do that more quickly and without a conscious awareness. So people with PTSD will often describe feelings of floating above their body as though they're watching what happened when they're having a flashback or reliving an experience. They'll often talk about feeling numb. And as a trauma-informed therapist, we try to teach the difference between the feeling of being neutral and the feeling of being numb. Numbness being no emotion and no feeling in your body at all. When we get to techniques and things that you can do as far as treatment later, we can talk about grounding techniques and why it's important to get back in your body. Some of those things, because they're comorbid, they overlap. And so grounding techniques are incredible for anxiety and depression as well. So let's see. So misconceptions, I started to talk about people saying that they feel like it shouldn't be that bad. And in therapy, we like to say, stop shoulding all over yourself. So we do that a lot in our own heads. And so one of the things that is so exciting about trauma treatment is in educating people as to why that happens on a human level and why it's not their fault is so freeing and so normalizing. So let me just start with basic brain ideas that Ryan already touched on. So everything comes into our brain initially as sensory perception, which is our amygdala. There was a screen on that earlier. So every piece of information that I am putting into context that my brain is filtering starts in the amygdala as a sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. What normally would happen is that different areas of your brain talk to one another. And so your frontal lobe, which is your time and space orientation, the thing that says that happened then and is not happening now, your logic, your reasoning is normally would be working in conjunction with this sensory perception. And so that's how we can kind of put things into a context and we can tell ourselves that we're safe in the moment. What we found in research with fMRIs and PET scans, things of that nature, they can physically see that when a person is activated, is the therapy term, meaning that they're having flashbacks, they're feeling symptoms of panic attacks, maybe racing heart, they can't breathe, etc. only their amygdala is lighting up. And so for some reason, it's not talking to that other area of their brain. And so one of the main treatments for PTSD is something called EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. But essentially what we're trying to accomplish is to get those two pieces talking to each other. And so in the lane of your amygdala and understanding how that works, that is your autonomic nervous system. That's your limbic system that does all of the things that your body does for you without thought. Your breathing, blood flow to your organs, your heart rate. And so when your limbic system is activated, you experience fight or flight, or what most people are not aware of is that the opposite reaction can occur, which we often call freeze and submit, or you might hear fight, flight, or freeze is often the way that it's talked about in literature on the subject. But with fight or flight, your body creates endorphins, so you can run faster, you get cortisol, stress hormones, you get more blood flow to your extremities and away from your center, so that you can fight off the tiger that might be chasing you, or the other clan in caveman days that you might encounter and have to fight to survive and have enough food. So this is our sort of caveman brain part. The freeze and submit response is sort of the opposite, a different set of chemicals, but in both of these, they're systemic. They are in your bloodstream, so it's going throughout your body. But with freeze and submit, you might think about a bunny rabbit hiding in a bush. You're going to have less blood flow to your extremities, and it comes to your core. Your breathing slows down, your digestion often slows down. And so people frequently we will experience things like constipation when they go into a freeze and submit response, and they don't realize that that's connected to their trauma. That one, for some reason, is not as commonly talked about in pop culture and literature. So I like to educate my clients on that as well, because it's confusing sometimes that they essentially don't act, or they have no action at all, or then they can beat themselves up rather than going into more action or wanting to fight or do something about it. So we see a lot of shutdown response with PTSD. So it's important to understand that from a physiological level, your body does this whether you like it or not. It's just like a smoke alarm. A smoke alarm is programmed to go off when it senses smoke. It doesn't matter if it's actually a fire or burnt toast, and it doesn't need to know the difference. It senses the smoke and the alarm goes off. Just like a smoke alarm, that sensory perception triggers that response in your brain. So if you, let's say, got into a car accident and a certain song was playing on the radio, it would not be uncommon 3 years later to hear that song on the radio and have a panic attack. And that part is so confusing for people because they don't understand why they're still responding that way when it's so much time has passed. So I think that's the empowerment part, is to help people understand that they don't have conscious control over that. It's a different part of the brain. The conscious awareness would be their frontal lobe, and those two aren't talking. So another common phrase that seems to be helpful is the idea that neurons that fire together wire together. If you picture them like little tree branches, and there's an electrical impulse that goes from point A to point B, and every time that happens, it gets fatter and fatter, and you're reinforcing that connection, that neural connection in your brain. That's why it's hard to break a habit, because you have to physically stop doing the thing so that there's no more electrical impulse, and it essentially dies off. It connects in a different direction with whatever the new response is that you're doing. So if you're trying to stop drinking pop, let's say, and drink water instead, every time you have the urge to drink pop and you choose water, you're no longer reinforcing that connection and you're reinforcing another one. So why is this important? Because when you're working with someone that has trauma, and like I said, is often associated also with depression and anxiety, and like Ryan beautifully put, that goes very much along with self-doubt, a lot of fear and anxiety, a lot of negative self-talk. One of the things that we're trying to do is reinstill hope. And that hope can come from the idea that there are ways to rewire your brain that are actually very simple and non-invasive. It might take some practice and some time, but with the right coaching and the right strategy, EMDR actually is very effective in a very short amount of time. I want to add, and we can touch on this more again when we talk about treatments, but statistically speaking, in the research, the combination of talk therapy and medication has the best outcomes rather than either one or the other. So I'm going to talk a lot about EMDR because that is something that I'm passionate about, but it is also very helpful for a lot of people to have an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication, sometimes so that they can do the work of talk therapy. If it's so anxiety provoking that we can't get to certain things, then they might need to be on something for a period of time in order to help them level back out so that we can make the real progress. And so we'll come back to that. So EMDR, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That's a fancy way of saying we're mimicking rapid eye movement in sleep. Now, one of the things that I love about the EMDR research is that they're very open with the fact that we don't fully understand sleep. We just know that we won't function without it. And that for some reason, the rapid eye movement phase of sleep seems to be the only phase of sleep that affected people if it was interrupted in the studies that they've done. And this has been around since the early 80s. So there's quite a bit of research at this point to back up the effectiveness of this treatment when it's done well by someone who's trained in it. So all we're doing is bilateral brain stimulation. And what that looks like on a day-to-day basis when you're working with someone is either you can do it with your hand or you can do it with a tool that I'll explain to you in a minute. But essentially you're having the person recall specific sensory information that the trained therapist is talking them through so that it doesn't re-traumatize them. We're doing it in a very specific, safe way. And then they're watching your hand go back and forth in front of them where their head is still, but just their eyes are moving. So similar to watching a tennis match, but you're not going to do this. It's just your eyes moving. Additionally, some therapists, not all, use what they call tappers that vibrate on either side. And there are also audio equipment that ping in the ears. Personally, I found that it's too much to do all three. But the light bar that I have, and most therapists that do this on a regular basis have some kind of light bar similar to mine that also has the tappers, because you can actually tear a rotator cuff doing this all day long. And so all you have to do is sit in front of this light with your therapist that you know and trust and watch the light as we go through some of the sensory experiences that you had along with this trauma. So to give you an example of how much it doesn't matter to your brain, how bad it was, I have used EMDR with veterans that have experienced combat. I have used EMDR with rape victims. And I've also used EMDR with head injury patients. So for example, I had a teenager once. She just turned 18. She was trying out for an Olympic volleyball team and got hit in the head at Olympic speed. And she was a 4.0 student and no mental health issues whatsoever. And from that moment on, she was having panic attacks. She started failing school. She needed to know where all the exits are, and kind of classic symptoms of PTSD because her amygdala kicked into any sensory experience that was similar, even if it was other people that were there at the same time. Because again, there is no context, there is no logic. And so I like to remind people and explain to them that feelings are not logical. It's physiologically a different part of your brain. That's so important. When our brain starts to get into that narrative that Ryan was touching on, that why am I feeling like this? It's not that bad. I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't feel like that. Different parts of the brain, so there is no logic. So therefore, there's no reason to feel guilty or shameful about it. So unlike traditional talk therapy, which is also extremely effective, but may take a little bit longer, people using EMDR tend to see results within 3 to 10 sessions. And sometimes talk therapy can take years. The problem is what you're doing with EMDR is getting at things that you may not be consciously aware of. So the way I like to explain it is as though you're driving a team of horses. And so there's reins back here. And the things that are operating back here, a therapy term we like to use is old tapes. If you can imagine like a ticker tape playing in your brain. These are your old patterns, your old ways of thinking. And they're turning you this way or that way, depending on the situation. Maybe you have some preconceived notion of whether or not you're good enough. And so you walk into a restaurant and to meet people you've never met before, and your old tape says, oh, they're never going to like me. They're, you know, I don't know why I even tried. Turned your head to the right. So when we do EMDR and we can access this stuff that's happening that you're not conscious of, all of a sudden we bring it up here and you can look at it and you can go, oh, okay, that's why I thought that way. And then we take it to another level of trying to integrate what in therapy we would call cognitive interweaves. So back to neurons that fire together, wire together. While you're doing the light bar, I'm, as your therapist, going to help you think in a new way and recognize, okay, that's what that is. We know what that is now. So we know it's no longer you. And you're watching the light bar and you're integrating that on a physiological level to say to yourself, now we can just call it an old friend. Every time unworthiness comes up, we go, oh, you again. I love you so much. I see you, unworthy part of myself, and I'm just going to imagine giving you a hug and telling you I love you. Which gets into internal family systems, which I'll come back to in a minute. But it doesn't have to be all heavy and all consuming when you do therapy. And I think that is a common misconception. Also, people are terrified because they think that it's going to be a lot of crying and a lot of pain. And at times it is, because you're dealing with some pretty heavy topics. But if you're doing it with someone that you're comfortable with and that you connect with, you can also infuse, and that should be part of the point, to infuse strengths, resources, inner resources, the things that you already do to help you and to add to the story of, instead of just what your memory is telling you, what were the facts? So one of the fascinating things about the way that our brain works and why trauma affects us in the way that it does is because it's stored at the age and sensory perception that you were in that moment. Because it's all based on those 5 senses, what we find is that if someone was, let's say, physically abused when they were 8 years old, I can think of a story off the top of my head. I had a client whose mother was schizophrenic. He always had to worry about either she would think that he was the devil or she would think the devil was after him. Either way, he sort of had to run for safety. So when we recall those memories, everything in the room is huge. The phone is a football field away. He can't get to it. He's overwhelmed. He feels powerless. And as we process that memory, all of a sudden he recognizes from his adult self, which is his frontal lobe, his rational thinking, right? That tells him the phone wasn't a football field away. It was his living room. It couldn't have been, right? So we're adding in that logic and the memory changes and the room shrinks and it's not so far away. And all of a sudden he remembers someone talking to him on the phone. He remembers the police officers showing up at the door because he called for help. And so not only are we able to, in a sense, subconsciously access things, but we're also integrating the time and space that has happened since then. So whether the trauma happened yesterday or 20 years ago, you're adding in the logic and the reasoning to tell yourself why you're safe now, which is very important to help people learn about staying in the present moment. So back to being in our body. Most people that have experienced trauma tend to dissociate from their body. So one of the easiest things that you can do, even if you're not doing EMDR or talk therapy, is breathe. To notice what it feels like to fill your diaphragm and what it feels like to let it leave your body. In addition, on a neurological level, 3 deep breaths. I like to use a technique called 4-7-8 breathing. You breathe in for 4 seconds. Ryan's familiar. I see you smiling. Hold it for 7 and then breathe out through your mouth as slowly as possible for 8. Now, some people can't do it that long. You know, if you have a history of asthma or something, there's no right or wrong. The idea is that slowing down your breathing tells your fight or flight response that you're no longer in danger. Your brain goes, oh, your body has calmed down, so there must not be a tiger chasing us anymore. You know, it's trying to keep you safe. And so we just, if we can externalize this idea that it's not us, it's the way that we're physically built, then we no longer have to own that as a part of our identity. Whether it's depression or anxiety or PTSD, that's true across the board. The more you can educate yourself on the way that your body works, the more you can separate that from your mental health, which is an extremely exciting thing to me. So I want to get to treatment modalities. Because that led me to the thought of something else Ryan touched on earlier, which is this idea, and I wasn't there for the last mind-body connection. It sounds fascinating, and I love that in general. The idea that our thoughts create chemical responses in our body. And so the example Ryan used earlier was being stressed and therefore having a heart attack, and then being stressed about the heart attack, this kind of negative feedback loop, right? So we actually can flip that on our head. One of my favorite trainings that I've done in the last couple of years was about the chemical response to the feelings of awe and wonder. And they didn't just look at positive awe and wonder, they looked at negative as well. So for example, you all probably remember where you were when you watched the Twin Towers come down on 9/11. That would be an experience of negative awe and wonder. You are just taken aback in a negative way. In a positive way, when we experience awe and wonder by being aware of gratitude and being focused on the things that are going well, on positive self-talk, the things that we, like Ryan said, would say to someone else, to turn around and say those to ourselves, to talk to yourself the way that you would talk to your best friend, that actually reduces cortisol levels, and you get serotonin, you get dopamine responses, you release positive chemicals into your body, which again, in either direction, positive or negative, they're systemic because they're through your bloodstream. So I love this, is one of my favorite examples because it blew my mind the first time I heard it, because it's so simple. If you and I are both looking at a flower and a bumblebee comes to land on that flower, and you are allergic and you think, oh my gosh, anaphylaxis, I'm going to die, I can't be near it. You immediately go into fight or flight, and you get cortisol and you get norepinephrine and all of these negative chemical responses. I might be standing right next to you and not have that issue and say to myself, oh my gosh, that is the most beautiful thing I've seen all day. And all of a sudden I get dopamine and I get serotonin and my cortisol levels go down. And here's the amazing thing, you guys, cancer is reduced, inflammation in the body, and arthritis gets better. It's so cool that we have the ability to change our physiological structure based on the way that we think and what we perceive. And so this idea that where your attention goes, energy flows, now there's a lot of science backing up and a lot of research, some of these basic principles. We have things like epigenetics, where they've taken 3 of the identical stem cells and put them in different petri dishes and exposed them to different environments. And one grew bone and one grew muscle. And I can't remember what the third one was. But the difference is that where we used to think that genes were sort of a read only, to use computer references, that they couldn't be changed, epigenetics is steering us in the direction of perhaps they can be turned on and off. Perhaps someone is predisposed to depression, like Ryan mentioned earlier. Maybe it runs in the family. Maybe anxiety runs in the family. But you have a different upbringing, or you have more mitigating factors, protective factors that occur in your life. There are a lot of studies on twins, for example, genetically identical, but one ends up in law school and the other one ends up in prison. So this is basic stuff, right? If we go back to like nature versus nurture, but science is catching up now to a lot of what used to be considered very fringe kind of woo-woo information about, like, just think positively and be grateful and you'll feel better. And it is that simple, and yet it's not. And that's what I love about the science behind it, because when you are depressed, you're not necessarily able to just focus on the positive. When you have PTSD, you can't just choose not to have it. And that's the part that I think Ryan was really emphasizing, trying to get across, to normalize for everyone, that it's not a choice. It is an illness in the sense that your body is responding, whether it's chemically or in your thoughts, or most of the time both. But that doesn't mean that we can't change it. And so by using things like EMDR, we can make pretty rapid progress within a short period of time. But also, Ryan asked me to touch on other treatment modalities, like what are some of the other options. As a marriage and family therapist, we are trained in systems thinking. Their classic example is like a mobile on a child's bed, that if you move one part, the whole thing shifts. And so in a family system or any kind of system, if I change and show up differently, the whole thing changes. It can't not. Which brings in the idea of homeostasis, that our body physically, our mind wants to stay at what it's used to. We are habitual creatures. And so one of the things that's very helpful, in addition to the brain work like EMDR, is something called narrative therapy. Cognitive behavioral, Ryan covered very well. Changing your thoughts in order to change your behaviors. Narrative therapy is about recognizing that you're the protagonist in your own story, and therefore you have the power to write that story however you want. So if I was raped and that was traumatic to me, I can choose to view myself as a victim, and I can live out of that fear and victimhood, which I may not even be consciously aware of. Or I can choose to see myself as a survivor. And that automatically shifts the way that I think and speak to myself. Now, it's important to say, I think, that most people have such good intentions and they don't realize or want to be in a victim role. That's part of their fight or flight response, that they're just trying to be safe. So, step one is supporting Ryan talked about this beautifully, integrating hope, supporting the person, identifying strengths, and telling them what they're already doing well, what they're already doing to protect themselves and to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. And one of the most basic things is that you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from experience. This will never happen again because now you're so hyper aware of it. it will never happen again because you hear every sound, you know where the exits are at every moment. And so using the symptoms of PTSD to actually help them calm down rather than fighting against it and saying, oh my gosh, you have PTSD, that's horrible, we need to fix that. Let's embrace it. Let's embrace all the parts of yourself and let's change the story together. Internal family systems is so powerful, and it's one of my favorite things to infuse in all the types of therapy that I do. That is the idea that all of us have parts of ourselves. Pop culture has latched onto the idea of the inner child and inner child work, so you've probably heard of that. That is one part of yourself. It's an extremely important part, and that is often the part that has the anxiety, that feels powerless, that feels helpless. And so when we can attend to that part, when we can love on her or him and tell her or him that they're safe, that you're there for them, your subconscious doesn't know the difference between factual reality and reality in your mind, which is a beautiful thing because there are all kinds of things that licensed therapists are trained to do to work with that. For instance, taking a traumatic moment and pretending you're watching it through an old movie reel and having the person make it black or white, play it frame by frame, back it up. The idea being that they're in control. And one of the things that we're trying to help them learn is that you can go into that experience and come back out. You can go into it and come back out, and you control that. So just because you're feeling the distressing feelings doesn't mean that you're not safe. And we're teaching your brain that as we're doing it. But another example of a part might be like the parent in you or the boss part of yourself. Sometimes these parts are not helpful. If we are at work, for instance, and we notice that someone's doing something that we don't like, we might want to jump in and correct them and parent them or bark at them. That's not going to be super helpful for keeping our job. However, if we need to set a boundary with someone or tell them no, or I'm not comfortable with this situation, so I'm gonna take a step back, that's exactly the part we want to call on, right? We want our mother hen, the mama bear part to come out and say, no, you're not going to infringe on my little girl. You're not going to take up her space. You're not going to tell her that she has to do things that she's uncomfortable with. And so in talk therapy, we have a lot of different modalities that we kind of pull from. Most of us, I'm speaking in generalities, some people only do one thing, but I think most clinicians that I am close to and respect their work, we're a hodgepodge of personalizing to whatever we think that person needs and what feels like it fits in the moment. And then, to layer on top of that, I think it's important to recognize and talk with people about historical events, like the difference in generations, what maybe is different about your parents' population because they were baby boomers, because their parents grew up in the Great Depression. And so how did that affect the way that they parented you? And how does your generation cope with that differently? Because again, every time we add on each of these layers, we're depersonalizing the experience and we're helping the person with the PTSD or depression or anxiety or what have you to recognize that it's not about them, it's not their fault, that there's a context to all of this and that we see things through different lenses depending on our life experiences. So I could go on and on about attachment theory and all kinds of other things that we could layer on there, but I don't want to take up any more time. But Ryan, I think I would ask, like, did I cover everything that?
Yeah, you were wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to switch it back now to the PowerPoint momentarily. It's just about over. Don't worry. I know it's been a bit of a long talk, chock full of information. Thank you, Amber, once again. You were amazing. I don't know about y'all. I've never heard of EMDR therapy before talking to her. You shed a very clear light on PTSD, what causes it, and just it was amazing. You did perfect. All right, one second. Let me share screen. Okay. All right. So in addition to the therapies and the things that Amber mentioned that we can do, there are also two breakthrough therapies that I would like to share with y'all, one of which we've already covered a little bit in this talk earlier, and one of which you have probably heard in the news at least a couple of times. So the first one is marijuana. Studies all over the United States and Canada have shown that medical marijuana can be a great solution for both mental and physical symptoms of PTSD. Because cannabinoid receptors are located in the brain and throughout the body, this treatment offers relief from things such as anxiety and hallucinations, as well as physical relief from PTSD symptoms such as pain and the inability to sleep. Cannabinoid receptors in the body help to replace neurotransmitters that are responsible for creating this fight or flight reaction that leads to extreme anxiety, or like Amber mentioned, the freeze and submit reaction. In one study in Ottawa, 72% of patients, PTSD patients, had fewer nightmares while receiving marijuana. And in another study in New York, people with PTSD, it was discovered that they may actually have more cannabinoid receptors in their bodies than non-PTSD sufferers, which could indicate why medical marijuana is so helpful for this condition. There was a study on rats that was done to test medical marijuana as well. They used cannabidiol medication, which is marijuana without the THC, which caused the subjects to forget about the pain they were feeling. Now, I want to be clear here. This medication, marijuana without the THC, is CBD, and THC is the compound that gets people high. Okay, so the medication that we're talking about now that can help people with their PTSD symptoms, the one that they tested on the rats, that is not the kind that Snoop Dogg smokes. Okay, totally different kind. These studies altogether lead scientists to believe that medical marijuana can help combat feelings of anxiety related to memories and reduce physical symptoms of anxiety. Another thing that is common among PTSD patients is that they are at a greater risk of substance abuse and self-medication. Veterans given cannabis by the VA in 2014 were shown to lower their use of alcohol and recreational drugs. And because they sought their medical marijuana from a medical source, their doctors were able to ensure that they were smoking the correct strain of marijuana in its purest form. I can't emphasize enough how important that is. This was not marijuana taken off the street with God knows what in it, with levels of THC that were off the charts, or as people like to say nowadays, not your grandfather's weed. This is weed that is functioning as medicinal, which is why it's called medicinal marijuana. This is not the kind of marijuana you would see people doing at parties or to get stoned. It is completely different. However, and this is shocking to me, overall, this practice has led to healthier patients in every study conducted. Mind you, these are patients with PTSD, and this might not be for everybody, but how many scientific studies are out there that can boast healthier patients in every study so far conducted? So this is a promising future medication that we could look into for PTSD patients, and it's also one of the reasons why you will see veterans, why veteran groups are so often big supporters of the medical marijuana industry and have played a huge role in getting it legalized. The other new possible PTSD treatment is one that we talked about earlier, which is psilocybin. Psilocybin seems to reset a portion of the brain known as the default mode network, which assimilates autobiographical information, thoughts of others, and considerations of past and future, almost like rebooting a malfunctioning computer. I don't think I can do it the same justice Amber said, but like earlier, she was talking about how sometimes when somebody who's gone through trauma recalls the memory, they are taking in the same sensory data as they had been before. So if they were small and the phone was far away. When they recall it now, it seems like the phone is extremely far away, even though now they can tell themselves, okay, well, it actually couldn't have been that far away. It couldn't have been the length of a football field, because if I think about going through that house nowadays, it's actually just the length of my living room. So psilocybin can help them reboot those thoughts. The hyperconnectivity in your brain allows you to look at life from a completely different perspective, which can help reconceptualize these traumatic events and memories which trigger PTSD. Currently, unfortunately, they are considered a Schedule I drug alongside meth, heroin, and bath salts. There's no actual medical basis for that. It's part of the war on drugs, which I won't go too deeply into. So far, medical studies have shown that psychedelic mushrooms are not addictive and they aren't toxic to our organs. And in fact, they cause the least amount of damage to users and others compared to other recreational drugs like alcohol, cigarettes, and marijuana. Still, I'm going to say this one more time, psilocybin and psychedelic compounds are very much illegal in the United States and very much so in Texas. So if this is something that you would like to see developed in the coming years, don't go out and do shrooms in front of a state trooper or something like that. Talk to your representatives and give them the relevant research. Talk to them about how it can help people with post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety. It's important that this stuff is very helpful, but it needs to be legal and medicinal for people to get the most benefit out of it. We have talked about a lot of stuff tonight, y'all. We've talked about depression. We've talked about anxiety. We've talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. And these things are problems that can be solved. I don't think there's a person who has a mental illness who considers having that mental illness fun, a good time, or even helpful to their lives. It is at the very least sapping, and at most it is debilitating. But we are more than our mental illnesses, and help is available. Mental health is complicated, but that doesn't mean that we should shrink away from it because it is so complicated. We need to have hope that things can get better. There are plenty of treatments available, and you are not the only one. The first step is to see a qualified mental health professional to find the root of the problem so you don't misdiagnose what's going on for you and you don't start running in the wrong direction. Seeking help does not make you weak. It doesn't mean you're not strong or capable or independent. It means you're brave enough to realize, like all people, you can't go through life alone. Nobody does. And that's a good thing because it means that you will have help now and forever. There are people who know exactly what you're going through because they're going through it too. And there are people who know what you're going through and they have been trained to help you. All right. There are a lot of treatments available. Everything from talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, EMDR, medications like SSRI, or depending on the state you live in, marijuana. Then there's lifestyle adjustments focusing on exercise, nutrition, and quality sleep. There are support systems all around you. There are people who want to help you. The best thing you can do for yourself if you have a mental illness is to realize that you have it. It does not have you. Treat yourself as if you were someone you were responsible for taking care of. Become aware of your thoughts, emotions, and worldview, and ask yourself, how might these be affecting your life? If you feel a flare-up of depression, of anxiety, of PTSD, try to take a moment to breathe deeply and ask yourself, where is this coming from? And be patient. It can take a lot of time to dig deep into your mind and figure out what's going on. Don't lose hope. I promise you there are people around you who are more than willing to supply you with hope and encouragement. And if you know somebody who might need hope and encouragement, please give it to them. Do not assume that they may be getting from another place or they can handle it on their own. There is never such a thing as too much encouragement or too much love. It can take time for a treatment to work, but it is worth it to go seek treatment if you or someone you know is suffering from a mental illness. Thank y'all for coming to this talk. on mental illnesses. I hope this has helped clarify what they are, how they come about. I hope it's helped clear up some of the misconceptions and helps you to understand yourself better if you have one, or understand those you love if you know somebody who has been having these problems. I hope that you will take this into the world with patience, kindness, compassion, and you will be able to make the world better one person at a time, especially starting with yourself. Thank y'all. Have a good day. These are my sources, and thank y'all for coming. We can, oops. Okay. If y'all have any questions, I can unmute. Okay, yeah. Okay, hold on. Let me unmute everybody. But you're going to have to speak one at a time. All right. Let's.
Okay, I want to say something.
Okay, yeah, Kira, go ahead.
You know me, I can't go without saying something. I want to say thank you, first of all, to Ryan for a tremendous presentation and doing the research and bringing this together for us. And I want to say thank you to my niece, Amber Lonsdale, and so grateful to have her wisdom. And she many of you know and were with us during Hurricane Harvey when I developed PTSD in the midst of that. And I will tell you, it was Amber that got me through that and helped me overcome it when I was in that panic. We must get everybody safe. We must get everybody safe. And I couldn't really function fully. And she helped me go through and work with my PTSD when I recognized finally that that's what was going on for me. And so that I couldn't continue 24 hours a day work and be effective. And yet that's what the PTSD was having me do. And so I want to acknowledge that as a special gift. And I'm grateful that she was willing to say yes and come on with us and our community and support us with her background in mental health. And Ryan, I just want to acknowledge these relevant conversations have been truly valuable. And I just have to acknowledge my brother, who is a neurologist, who has been on this all with us as well. And thank you, Mark, for all the things that you've taught us all that we carry down as your sister and as your daughter, also in our awareness. So thanks for doing what you do out there in the world. So thanks. And I just have to acknowledge all my loved ones here and every one of you that are part of my loved ones out here. So thanks, everybody. Now you can answer questions. So.
Well, I mean, we've got to have some questions. Does anybody have any questions? I mean, if y'all don't, that's okay. But, you know, while we've got a therapist here.
I just want to say it was an excellent talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Learned a lot.
I have a question. How do you determine between anxiety and PTSD?
That's a good one.
Well, that's a very good question. I think severity has a lot to do with it. Some of the, if you remember some of the differences with PTSD, you would have flashbacks, very intense or vivid thoughts, memories, and dreams about a specific event or series of events. You don't necessarily have that with general anxiety. Generalized anxiety, the term, comes about because it's not about one thing. It's sort of across the board, all the time, a low level of worry, sometimes a high level of worry. But in general, you're worried about everything and nothing. PTSD tends to be triggered by some event. Now, remember, it doesn't have to be that bad, but there usually is a precipitating event. The avoidance piece and the hypervigilance are the other two PTSD specific things that we as clinicians look for. So if you, the kind of classic hypervigilance would be an intense startle response. You know, your kids yell or laugh loudly and you jump, or a door shuts in your office hallway and you startle at it. Needing to know how to get out of situations, finding the exits, or strategically placing yourself in a room so that you know that you can escape is a symptom of PTSD rather than general anxiety. That would be considered more severe than generalized anxiety. The avoidance is, no longer going to the grocery store if that's where you got assaulted, or not even leaving your house. If someone experiences something negative at school, they may not be able to go to school anymore. Avoiding people that were around, even if they didn't do anything wrong or anything negatively, but they were part of that experience. Like in the car crash example, maybe someone was in the passenger seat and you love them and they're a good friend, but you can't see them because it reminds you of that experience. That would be PTSD rather than just generalized anxiety.
What if you hear just the sound of the crunching of the metal that is stopping you actually from driving at night?
So what is the question? I'm sorry.
How about sound? Like there is no sound, but you're hearing the crunch of metal in a car accident.
Yeah, so I would say that that's usually a PTSD symptom. If you had a car accident and it's like you're, in a sense, I don't want to say imagining, but you're overlaying in your thought the sound of crunching metal, or you're worried about
Going to bed, Jax?
hear that.
Sorry.
Did you have a question, Jen, or? Okay. Yeah. So I don't know if that answered your question. I think that would be something I would maybe want to screen more, know more about, to know what else is happening. Is that the only thing, or are there other symptoms that might be PTSD related? A lot of people have PTSD symptoms and they don't even realize it. They think that it's just anxiety. Because again, we want to tell ourselves it's not that bad. And then for some reason as humans, we overlay guilt and shame around the fact that it's so bothersome to us. But you can do EMDR just on particular problems or particular symptoms. So you could find an EMDR therapist that could work with you specifically about hearing the sound of crunching metal, for instance. I didn't add, I guess, at the end of mine that on my website, which I'm assuming is listed somewhere, Ryan.
I can add it to the final YouTube video we put up.
I have a link under services. There's individual therapy, couples therapy, and EMDR. Those are the three choices. So if you click on EMDR, you can find the national and international associations and all of their related resources just by going to the website. And you can actually search by location, zip code, city, state to find EMDR trained therapists in your area. So I would just seek out somebody that's at least trauma informed and ask them more. But that's an excellent question because it's so specific to a certain thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I can unmute you if you're not unmuted already. All right, we're going to wrap up then. Thank you all for coming. I know it was a long talk. Thank you all for sticking around. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Amber, for being the guest here tonight, for all your insight and your wisdom, your experience. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out one more time. I will see y'all on Sunday. Have a good night, y'all.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, everybody.
Oh,
Bye.
good night.
Bye. Bye.